Back, everyone. All right, so we've talked a bit about history jobs, what you can do with a history degree, what history-related things you can do with a history degree, and I mentioned that for a lot of these things in history-related sectors, you will need a graduate degree, whether it's a master's or a PhD. So what we're going to move on to now is talking a bit about grad school, what grad school is, the kind of logistics of it, and also what the experience is like. And so I've kind of broken it into two sections here. More practical questions, and then more experience-driven questions. So two of the more practical questions that actually kind of relate to each other. Someone asked, give or take, how much more is grad school compared to undergrad? And I'm assuming that you meant how much more money does grad school cost than undergraduate degree does. So that's where I'm going to take that question. If that's not what you meant, then hopefully leave a comment and I can try to answer your question a little bit better. So how much more money does a grad school entail than an undergrad? And also how long does a grad school take to complete? So to speak first to the question of money and finances, graduate degrees do tend to be by term or by year more than an undergraduate degree, although they're short, or at least a master's degree is shorter than an undergraduate degree. So you won't be paying the same amount, but per year it does tend to be a little bit more expensive. Again, obviously that's going to vary between school, between country. There are funding opportunities for graduate school. Most provinces, I believe, I know for sure that Ontario and Nova Scotia do have funding opportunities through their graduate scholarship programs. And often individual schools will also have some sort of funding opportunity, maybe not a full ride, but sort of smaller amounts that they might offer to particularly promising master's students. For a PhD, you still have these graduate scholarships. You also have SSHRC, which is the Canadian funding body that funds social sciences and humanities research. SSHRC stands for Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So that's something that you can also apply to try to fund the years that you spend doing your PhD. So the short answer there is masters are often self-funded, but there are graduate scholarships and funding opportunities, and they are shorter, but they are in the short term sort of more expensive to the comparative amount that you might pay for 2 years of an undergrad, for example. Talk quickly about PhDs. PhD funding really depends on what country you're operating in. So for example, in North America, in Canada, and the United States, PhDs are usually funded for at least 5 years. You'll usually be expected to teach or TA as part of this funding. And in humanities, funding packages are rarely a lot. They might seem like a lot up front, and you are kind of getting paid to do your research and to teach, but you do have to look at this funding package in comparison with the cost of living of the city that you will be residing in. So a funding package usually means that your tuition is paid and you receive a living stipend. From what I've heard from my own experience, this living stipend tends to be around $15,000 to $20,000 a year, which, as I said, really stretches differently in every city that you live. To live on a year, if that's your only source of income, on $15,000, $17,000, $20,000, especially if it's a city like Toronto, for example, can be difficult. So it's not unusual to have to work in some capacity to supplement this income, and that means working outside of even the work you're doing towards the funding package. So whether that's taking on more teaching, research assistantships, work study jobs, part-time jobs outside of the university, that's a pretty common thing to do. Unfortunately, when you do take on this extra work, which is often just absolutely necessary if you want to survive, then what tends to happen is you stretch out the time to completion of your degree, because you're now not just centered on this degree, you also are doing supplementary work, and that can make it, especially teaching, which can make it much more difficult to get all the work completed in the year that it's supposed to be completed. So that will often stretch your degree past the funded years, so usually 1 to 5. Most people I know had at least 1 year where they were unfunded, often 2 or 3, meaning that they not only had to pay tuition, but they also didn't receive a living stipend. So in these unfunded years that follow the funded years, you will need to kind of come up with your own income in addition to doing your research. So that kind of speaks to how long the degrees take, that second question there. Masters are usually 1 to 2 years. If you're doing it full-time, part-time degrees can obviously take a bit longer. And in North America, PhDs usually take around 5 to 7 years, often up to 8 or 9. So it is a hefty time commitment, and there are kind of a lot of logistical things that you kind of have to think about in advance if you do want to do a PhD. Someone asks, do you need to complete a thesis to get into grad school? I've heard conflicting stories on if I need to do so or not. This might have changed since I applied to grad school, I guess 7 years ago now. For a master's, I definitely don't recall having to have completed a honors thesis or an undergraduate thesis. Usually all that these applications want is a writing sample that is of a sufficient size to get a gist of how well you research and how well you write. So that's where a thesis can sometimes come in handy, because often just the length of the kind of term papers that you might be writing for history courses are not long enough to give you this writing sample, which I believe is kind of anywhere from 12 to 20 pages, if I remember correctly. So doing an honors thesis or an undergraduate thesis will often give you a paper of sufficient length that you will kind of have a ready-made writing sample there. Often a writing sample, I know when I applied for my PhD, I submitted a writing sample in a totally different subject than medieval history. I think it was like 19th century France. And they came back to me and said, please submit something on medieval history. So that's another way that a thesis can help, because presumably you are choosing the subject of this thesis, and it's something that if you are applying to graduate school, that's sort of the route you're planning on taking, whatever that thesis topic is. And so that can also help as well. You have kind of a demonstration of the research skills you have within the topic that you've chosen, that's kind of ready-made for submission. But I've never seen, you'll have to look this up, but I personally have never seen a thesis requirement on graduate school applications, just a sufficient writing sample. One thing I will say about doing a thesis is it can be a good exercise to give you a taste of what you might expect in a master's or a PhD. If you hate writing your honors thesis, then it might not be the career path or the academic path for you to undertake sort of primarily research-driven degrees. So it could be a good way to kind of weed that out and really see if that's something you want. So I would say not absolutely necessary, but definitely probably helpful. All right, so let's move on to the experience questions. Bluntly, someone asks, what is grad school all about? Is it similar to an undergrad or completely different? What kind of work do you do? And then the second question that kind of carries on from that is, I'm told grad school is much more independent than an undergraduate. Can you elaborate on this? Okay, so let's divide this into masters and PhDs. So masters, you usually have 2 kinds of masters. One is called a taught masters, and one is a research masters. They may not be explicitly called these 2 things when you look them up or when you're doing your research, but you can kind of get a gist from the descriptions of the programs, kind of what one you'd be applying to. A taught master's is usually a lot closer to the experience that you might have had as an undergrad. So you would be taking courses, writing probably fairly long-term papers in these courses, and you might have sort of a mini thesis or something at the end, but I know at U of T, for example, the medieval studies degree at U of T is primarily course-based. So in that way, that sort of mirrors the undergrad experience a little bit more. A research master's is definitely something that's looking forward a little bit more to what the PhD experience will be. So it is kind of an abrupt juncture from, or not juncture, break from what you might have experienced during your undergrad. A research master's, you might take one or two classes, and then you'll often be required to write a thesis of a certain word count or a certain length at the end. So really depends on what experience you want to get out of it. If you are already intending on doing a PhD, then a research master's is maybe something that you want to pursue because it'll give you a better taste of what you're in for and if you actually like that kind of work. If you are more partial to kind of instruction and you maybe aren't intending on going any further, then you might want to pursue a top master's. There really isn't, I mean, it again might depend between like within the actual selection committees for PhDs if they prefer one or the other, but there isn't really supposed to be a difference between a taught versus a research master's as far as if one's more prestigious than the other. Really kind of emphasizing different skills. For a PhD, it's kind of depends again on the country and the school as to what the overall experience will be. In North America, what tends to happen is you will have 1 to 2 years of coursework. This isn't a full course load like you're used to at undergrad. It might be kind of like, again, 1 or 2 courses, maybe 3. After these 2 years of courses, you will often have a year of some kind of qualifying exams, comprehensive exams, maybe oral or written exams that will ensure that you are at the proper kind of caliber, that you have the correct sort of skill set to continue on with your PhD. You'll often have to do language exams during these years as well. If you are pursuing a history degree at a PhD level, it's usually expected that you will have at least reading knowledge of 1 or 2 other languages within the kind of realm of study that you're pursuing. So that's something to definitely think forward to if languages aren't something that you're very strong at. After these qualifying exams, you'll usually have 2 to 5 years of writing your thesis on a historical inquiry or topic that you've decided to tackle. A thesis is usually around 300, 400 pages, give or take. So the research and the writing does take quite a while. European PhD programs and British PhD programs tend to be much shorter. Usually 3 to 4 years because there's no coursework involved, and usually not any kind of qualifying exams. It's just writing your thesis. Again, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this, but in the UK, these are rarely funded. So a lot of people self-fund or depend on external bodies. So unlike the PhD in North America, where you do have kind of up to 5-6 years of funding, in the UK, it's a shorter degree, but it's often something you'd have to pay for yourself. As far as independence, you do have supervision, especially during your thesis writing period. So you are answerable to usually 1 or 2 or even a committee of faculty members who are kind of in charge of guiding your progress, but it is incredibly independent. There isn't really much of a structure unless you make one for yourself. It can be very isolating. There's not a lot of kind of collegial time, again, unless you go out of your way to make it. So I would say that a good indication is, I mean, this year's obviously had a lot of extenuating circumstances, but if you found that like the lack of structure, not being able to go to a class, not being able to have that schedule for you was something that you hated and that didn't really work for you, then you might want to consider the feasibility of doing something like a PhD because it is incredibly self-motivated and self-structured. And the last question that someone has here, what happens after grad school? Should I go on to do my PhD? Again, you need to determine that based on kind of the research that you do and some of the hints that I gave you in the first half about whether a PhD is needed. Often a master's is a good kind of place to end if you are more interested in some of these kind of heritage-based sectors. After a PhD, again, you don't have to go into academia. There are a lot of other routes. So ultimately, that's a really personal decision as to if you want to go on to another degree and what you want to do after grad school. I would just say my best advice is when you're applying to grad school, take a really good look at the program descriptions, reach out to faculty members, ask questions, see if they'd be interested in supervising or working closely with you. It's always good to make connections between the schools that you're interested in and the work that you're currently doing or the work that you are excited to do or you want to do. All right, I think that leaves me at 15 minutes. Hopefully this was helpful. I think if you have any questions, you can maybe direct them to Avery and he can get them back to me. And yeah, I hope everyone has a great summer. Good luck with applications if that's something you will be doing. And thanks for coming out today. Bye-bye.